So my name's Kyle. I'm an English instructor at Gavilan College, and I'm one of the co-presenters here today.
Hi, I'm Erik Armstrong. I teach at College of the Sequoias in the Central Valley, and I teach English, and I'm also one of the co-presenters. Happy to be here.
Good morning, y'all. I'm Nicole Bryant Lescher. I'm English faculty at College of the Redwoods and I'm a coordinator with 3CSN, and so thrilled to be able to be here this morning. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you to Lauren for inviting us here today. And the work that we're doing here is in large part because of her leadership with Equity 101. So thank you to her. And like my colleague said, thank you to all of you for being here and choosing to spend a little time with us today to think about our students and thinking about our practice and maybe even thinking about ourselves in new ways. So to start off with, since this is a session in large part about reading in community, we thought a good way to start off would be to read together. And instead of reading with one another, we thought maybe we could literally read to one another. So Erik has found a poem called, appropriately enough, A Ritual to Read to Each Other. It's pretty short, and so we're going to invite you to just read along with us in whatever way you want to do it. That can be just to listen and enjoy it, but we're also going to invite you, if you are so inclined, to read some of it to us. So read as much or as little as you'd like. Just stop wherever you'd like. You can read a sentence or a stanza. And then when someone stops, if someone feels like jumping in, please do. When we're done with this, we have a couple of reflection questions we'll ask you to think about to help us set some intentions for the rest of the day. But I'll read the title, and then maybe someone would be willing to jump in. So this poem, again, is called A Ritual to Read to Each Other by William E. Stafford.
If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star.
Oh, we've got you all on mute and you can't unmute yourselves. Oh,
I undid it. Everyone should be able to unmute.
Hooray! Let's start again. Yay!
I'll read the next one. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike.
Yes. Looks like Scott still can't unmute, so I'll continue as well. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could not fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life gets lost in the dark.
I'm gonna manually unmute Scott if I can. Oh no, I can't.
I'm unmuted.
There we go.
Would you like to bring it home, Scott?
For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep.
Thank you for that. So before we begin our short part, just to share some takeaways of our presentation, if you just take maybe 60 seconds to jot down a couple of ideas or think about a couple of ideas, which I think are on the next slide. And that is maybe make note of something from what we just read that might have resonated with you, a word or an image. Jot down a couple of ideas. Or the second question, just think about a couple of ideas about the role reading plays in your life, either personally or professionally. Just about 60 seconds to individually write some ideas down.
Kyle, you're muted if you're trying to talk.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for doing that. We are going to ask you just to loop back to whatever you may have thought of or responded to a little later in the presentation. So this is just a way for us to set some intentions for ourselves and to segue into the main part of our presentation. So thanks for doing that. And I will turn this over to Eric.
Thank you, Kyle. So before we get started with the group discussion, we wanted to share a little bit of our experience working in community with each other, talking about equity. And the first slide here stresses 3 takeaways, but essentially all of them tied together are really about how working in community can help us find ourselves in each other. That there's an interesting kind of GPS, if you will, where you have to know where you are, you have to kind of triangulate yourself between not just yourself, but also other things out in the world, and that the being partnered with Nicole and Kyle like we were, it helps us figure out ourselves and our own biases by seeing what other people are thinking, feeling, reacting to concepts about equity and their practices. And that through that, we build trust with each other. And that trust is vital in order for us to be willing to see ourselves better, and as well as see other people and what they're doing better. So community is a really important way for us to kind of find ourselves, which I think is really powerful. Nicole, you go to the next one. And then I think that trust allows us to do something that's really important in education, I think. And my take is that partner to that imposter syndrome that happens to so many of us as we move through the academy is that when we come out of it and we become part of it officially, we develop a kind of like academic armor around who we are and how we practice and how we see ourselves in our teaching. But because we were involved in that powerful community where we built that trust and can see ourselves and see others, it gave us permission to not behave that way. And it meant that we could talk about the struggles that we are having with teaching when we talk about grading and when we talk about equity. And we know that when we look at our own teaching data and our campus's data, that our work is not equitable, despite maybe our best intentions and our best efforts, and our souls like invested in the work, which often triggers that armor. We want to, and when people ask us like, well, how do you grade? How do you do this, right? We suddenly want to put on that armor and say like, I know why I'm doing what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. But that community allowed us to set that down. And the book that we were reading calls this out, and you can see the wonderful quotation there that's on the slide. But he calls it the third rail. And I think it's a powerful metaphor because, and I think many of us might be experiencing this on our campuses right now as we talk about equity, that raising the discussion triggers a lot of people and reactions. And when we talk about grading and the outcomes from our instruction on students and in particular equity among our students and their success, we have to find ways to work together to get beyond that triggering, beyond that pain, beyond that armor, in order to find a way to meaningfully work together. And we found that community is one of the ways that we can do that. So I think next up is Nick, yes?
So I think that's what our little schematic said we would do. So yeah, I think Erik segued so well into this with his points about the way in which sometimes being in higher ed disincentivizes that vulnerability, right? And it might make us either be, as I would say with my students, right, inclined to believe things or inclined to disbelieve things and not to challenge those notions, because that vulnerability, there's a million reasons why being vulnerable in higher ed can be really challenging, right? Especially if we're considering the different ways in which higher ed rewards remaining not vulnerable over time, right? And so we found that doing the book group together, not only did it invite us to set that armor down, because we were building trust, because we said we wanted to do this together, but I think we surfaced one way or another every time we met that reading this book together kept us pushing ourselves to be believers and be doubters of the text, and that we weren't always in the same place, right? So Erik and I joked about that a lot, that there were frequently times where Erik and I were not in the same place. Either Erik was deeply believing and I was super doubting, or Erik was super doubting and I would come in with a belief. And because we had encountered the reading differently and then we dialogued about it, we found ways to re-see something because of that other person's perspective. And that practicing that was good, that it kept us reading and it built our capacity to hear other perspectives and learn, right? And so a lot of that comes back to that center place of being able to sit in the pain and discomfort of practicing believing and doubting. And then if we layer on that we're reading about inequitable systems and investigating our own practices, it gave us a great opportunity to sit in that discomfort and the pain of knowing that we're participating in inequitable systems in higher education, and that there's a pretty straight line between grading practices and inequality for students, inequity for students, excuse me. And so doing the book group together let us pause there and not glide over that because of how uncomfortable that might feel. So really the big umbrella is that being in that book group together kept our students and our practice at the center. When it felt vulnerable, when the temptation was there to sit back and relax into what would feel best for us, because we had built that trust and we were working together and we were practicing that believing and doubting, we were able to continue to re-center on our practice for students and what this would do for students, right, to make these changes. The easier option would have been to rationalize keeping what we had, but we had lots of reasons to check ourselves before stepping back into that status quo and staying there. And I can't remember, is this me? Kyle, is this me? Yes, thanks. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. And so, you know, those are all the reasons that we felt like reading in community, in particular with a book focused on teaching and grading and equity, was important, but we would like to double down on that and say that we felt it was critically important that we do this work now. This year in particular, doing this book group this summer, on the surface looked a little bit loony, right? We all had a lot on our plates to do, but taking on this book, which inevitably meant taking on the invitation to overhaul how we grade and how we think about grading as it relates to the potential for student success. You know, while having to develop new courses online and or take on teaching online for the first time, and in the midst of the pandemic, and in the midst of acute racial tension in our country. Again, those could have been invitations to remain with the status quo, but we actually found that by taking on this work in the midst of all that, it was richer work. It felt really powerful to make that choice to do it right now. And we gained so much from the productive struggle of that lean in to that work.
So these are some of the questions. That's kind of what we had to share with you all. We wanted to, I think it's always more powerful, just like in our classrooms, when you all are talking with one another. So we're going to segue to that. So we just have some sentences we'd like to invite you to consider. If one of these resonates with you, great. I'm going to give you a couple of times to, or a couple of minutes to maybe jot down some ideas to one that resonates with you, or one that is your own that's on your mind right now. You can please ignore any of these. But these are just some of the things that we'd like to offer you to consider. So the first one, how do you build a community with colleagues you have in a system that privileges individualism and discipline knowledge over collaboration and or scholarship of teaching and learning? Would someone be willing to read the second one, if you have the power of the unmuting?
How do we get institutions and colleagues and ourselves consistently to value and make time for reflection, norming, and several other inquiry and community building sustaining processes that transform learning?
How do we make space within our institutions for deep equity work that requires community building and questioning core elements of institutional identity?
And what does communal learning look like? And how does this align with or rub against the notion of flex work and professional development? So maybe one of those you'd like to just spend a short amount of time with, or maybe something else that's on your mind from the top of this presentation with the poem, or something that came up in our share outs. But we'll invite you to just spend a couple of minutes to think about some ideas that are bubbling up before we ask you to introduce yourself to one another in smaller groups and talk about it. So just a couple of minutes for reflection.